I was at the University of Cincinnati, I was what they call a cooperative student. I worked 2 months and went to school 2 months, worked 2 months and went to school 2 months, and I interned for primarily one architect in Cincinnati for 6 years.
What a beautiful town, Cincinnati.
Yeah, it's a nice place.
Yes.
So I worked for a local architect. I worked for another local architect for a short, less than a year. And I moved to New York and worked for an architect by the name of George Nelson, who was the former editor of Architectural Forum, one of our best magazines at that time. It's no longer in existence. And from George Nelson's office, who George also designed furniture and graphic art as well as architecture. And from that, at the time I was there, I won the Prix de Rome and went to Rome. So while I was in Rome, I did some night work and weekend work for Walter Gropius, who had an office in Rome, but that was a very short stay. He was working on the University of Baghdad.
Oh, I see. Okay.
At that time. And I never saw the buildings. But that's the only moment that I worked for anybody that anybody would ever have heard of.
I see.
He had a small office in Rome. And then I moved back here and started teaching at Princeton in 1962, and started my own practice in '64.
Yeah.
So that's the history of that.
So who you feel that was your influencing, or any specific architect, or one that you really felt that you belong to somehow, or?
And as an undergraduate, we were really taught the modern movement through the work of Mies van der Rohe. At Harvard, prevailing interest was Le Corbusier. And when I returned to the United States after my time in Rome, I met Colin Rowe, and Colin was engaged in his studies on the influence of Le Corbusier on the modern movement and then on architecture in general. And I think there were a whole group of us, Peter Eisenman, Richard Meyer, Charles Guattari, and so on, who were interested in a sense, working in the manner of Le Corbusier through the academic work of Colin Rowe.
Yes.
So for the first few years, and even during the publication of the book called Five Architects, we were working in that manner, and I found, though there is no doubt that Le Corbusier is a terribly influential and interesting architect, I found for myself the language to be somewhat limiting, and so I started to experiment with other issues of color and form and so on to try to be, I suppose, and I think some of this influence was that of Rome finally coming back into my work, but I was trying to broaden my perspective on the symbolic values of architecture, and I couldn't do that with the language of the book. The thing about Rome is that it isn't just an antique city, it isn't just a Baroque city, it isn't a city that becomes styleless when seen as a kind of integrated city in the life and culture of that and the urbanity of that place. And I think that's what influences me the most, that all of those manners of working are integrated into a fabric of a city that finally rather than it being a singular kind of place. No, as a child I didn't know what architects did, and I drew all the time, and therefore I thought that must mean I was an artist, and that's what I wanted to do. But through influences of my parents, my mother especially. She directed me to architecture rather than to painting, I think through a kind of conservative viewpoint, and thinking that architecture would be safer than painting if I weren't a very, very good painter. And she thought as well that she could help me, or at least direct me in terms of education and so on, with architecture, where she was not as well versed in painting and art as, and felt uncomfortable in recommending places for me in that regard. So as a very young child, I started to become interested in architecture, and there was never any question. There was a document in the competition that gave points for various elements of all the designs. The amount of square footage for each floor, the size of the core, the functionality of the distance of the core to the window wall, the amount of illumination. Everything in it was scored in the competition.
Like a checklist.
Yes, and depending on how well you did, your score was registered as part of the criteria for judging, as well as the budget and the timing and so on. And because the transmission of light into the building was less high than the score that one would gain for heating and cooling inside the building, one could condition the wall in a way with a solid wall and score higher than if you had no windows at all. Well,
yes.
We also were interested in keeping the surface of the building as I had designed the building. Each of those windows was next to a desk for the open office systems, and when the building was finally built, we didn't receive the commission for the interiors, and therefore the way it was ultimately described by the architect who did do the interiors was the reverse of my intentions. He put what we call the hard wall offices next to the outer surface, and the open office systems to the core, which is more normal. I thought it important to try to reflect the kind of openings in glass dimensions that were in the historical part of Portland, rather than the glassy all glass towers that were nearby by Skidmore's and Merrill and other architects. Because so much of those buildings, all those buildings were doing was really reflecting the classical and neoclassical architecture of Portland. And therefore we made the windows as we did. In retrospect, I think the windows could have been a little bigger and still maintained the surface and still given us the point value we needed for the competition, and perhaps we misjudged it by 6 inches or so. But I didn't think it was very risky, because I had buildings like that, or designed buildings like that, for Fargo, North Dakota, and Moorhead, Minnesota, and for here in Princeton, certain houses and so on. But what I was doing at that time, I had been doing for a period of time, that no longer was it something that was shocking to me, at least.
Yes.
And so I thought it was very tame. I was very surprised that it caused the reaction it did. I was already reacting against that.
Yeah.
So what you do for that reaction is one thing, but there were lots of paths I could have taken. Obviously, I did what I did. But this building is, in the end, very, very simple units. And it won't mean anything to an Egyptian reader, but you'll have to translate it. The building cost $51 a square. As I said before, the language, the modern language that I was using, that of early Le Corbusier, I found too narrow for the expression that I thought necessary for the myths and rituals of architecture and their expression. I couldn't make a proper door. I didn't know how in a glass box to make a window. I could only make a window wall. I couldn't make a place where you or I could sit down next to a window, have a cup of coffee and look out. I could only, as at that time my training was such that windows were not windows, as I say. They might go from floor to ceiling and wall to wall, but they gave no sense of the anthropomorphic resonance to the room. And I was interested in re-seeing that possibility, how to arrange furniture, how to stand next to a window, how to allow a French door to open onto a terrace, and so on.
Yes.
All that seemed to me much more interesting and vital to thresholding from the inside to the outside than a sliding glass wall, which seemed to me the most boring thing one could ever imagine. Well, the glass house of Philip Johnson is an interesting building in its setting because it is in the woods. It's not seen from the road. It's in a very rural situation, and it is more like a tent than anything else, and it's a place for entertainment. Early on, he slept across the way in his brick house, which was like a little embattled object sitting in the field, and that pavilion or tent-like atmosphere invades this house with marvelous light. But again, the divisions are very general, and I prefer, I suppose, to have an equity between what is general and what is specific in a building. And as good as the glass house is, it for me fails in that dimension. Well, Leo was here for only one term, and we taught a class together. Leo walked into my office one time and saw a project I was working on, and I think it must have registered something with him because he made the comment, well, I guess it's in the air, and that meant that many of us were feeling the same kind of attitude toward this, not so much neoclassicism, but at least the anthropomorphic attitude that neoclassicism provides. But what Leon Creer's influence on me and perhaps others is his interest in doing away with the dogmatism of a kind of monolithic architecture. Leo, with his ability to compose within the vernacular, even with monumental or large buildings, is able to break down the scale into more humanistic elements. And Beaux-Arts classicism, in a sense, did just the opposite. It made pieces larger and larger and larger, even though they might be elemental in their own right. They grew to such proportion that finally they were overpowering to the urban scale. And I love the idea of Leo Creer insisting on urbanity, and always insisting that the building have a resonance in a city structure, in a city organization as a typology. Even if it's a building for a rural setting, it has a resonance for the city. One imagines how it might be, one, if the city were built around it, or two, whether it were brought to the city. And I think those are the kinds of issues that finally are very, very influential, brought by Leo Creer. Well, in the Keystone House, when the keystone was removed from the front gate, it was seen as a rhetorical gesture. If one so expects it to be there as a part of the the arch surrounding the primary entrance. I thought I could, in a mannerist way, remove it and reinstate it in the garden in a sense, as a whole pavilion.
Yes.
And that's what I did for the swimming pavilion behind it. And perhaps it's too literal, and I might not do that today, but nevertheless, then it was a period of experimentation with those elements to see what the culture or the society expected and how one could play on those expectations. When you make those drawings and you argue for it and it's not built, especially in city funds, with city funds and so on, it's not going to happen. But that idea is still potent as a value of not just a city in the air, but that you're making a new ground plane, and that's really what I wanted to express. And given that people like you remember that, it finds its way back into an architectural culture in other guises, and I think that's where it's important a lot. No, we've done over 300 projects, and though these are seminal and interesting projects, the fact that none of those three were built is that there are good reasons for that. In the first instance, the Moorhead Bridge was put on a democratic ballot and voted with the opposition wanting a golf course versus the cultural entity of the city wanting a new museum. The museum lost to the golf course, and that's the end of that story. Once that had happened, the building stands there only as an idea, and they still haven't built anything.
Yes.
The next project, the Columbus Circle project, was what we call a developers competition, and really has to do more with the kind of deal that the developer makes with the city for a particular site, in this case the Columbus Circle, than it does with the architecture. The architecture is there to ratify the developer's claims on the architectural consequences of what he is proposing. But that project was, I think, about 8 or 9 years ago, and it's just today, just this last month, that the project of the winning scheme, which was not ours, originally Moshe Safdie was let go by Boston Properties, who won the competition as a developer, then hired Skidmore and Merrill, and their project is now dead. The developer has lost something like $27 million on that site. So we didn't win the competition, our developer didn't win the competition, but it wasn't an architectural competition. It was about money and timing and deals. It wasn't about building. Certainly there are times where we really felt we had by far the best scheme, but we had many good votes from the jury, but not enough to prevail, and Barton Myers won. But it wasn't built either, and sometimes when there isn't the right chemistry, these things come to a halt. I think my life would have been worse if I had gone through and not built the building. In the case of the Whitney, we did 3 schemes, and then after the 3rd scheme, the Whitney board fired the director of the building, and he was our primary supporter. And so once the director was gone, the building was over. I think that's marvelous. They sound great to me. No problem. I'm teaching with Peter Eisenman this coming fall at Princeton. We're having a course together, a design course together, so that should be interesting. We haven't taught together since 1963. So Peter's a very good friend of mine, but I don't believe in his architecture at all. I mean, this is what my architecture is diametrically opposed to that.
Absolutely.
It isn't a matter of just style. And Peter's work has enormous energy and an abstraction that finally disavows and disallows the human body. And that's not of no interest to me. So in a way, it's not a matter of criticizing his architecture, because for me, architecture is rooted in the body and in myths and rituals and symbolism, and Peter's symbols are out for me, and I think at times for him, outside the realm of architecture itself. Peter would respond, I think, by saying that his architecture is not a part of the classical tradition, but it's architecture nonetheless. That may be, who might judge, but at the same time, it's a building where, as I said before, I can't sit down and have a cup of coffee.
Yes.
It's about angst. It's about it's an aggravated building. It's a building that is so heavily charged with its own anger that it destroys as much as it tries to knit together on that canvas.
What do you think of Prince Charles' book of the Vision of Britain? Or did you read it, or did you have a chance?
No, I haven't read it.
Yeah. Well, anyways, it's very much actually pro your humanitarian look at buildings.
Yes, but he probably wouldn't like my buildings either. Prince Charles, even in the time that I've met him and known what he is interested in, has changed himself into really a classical architect. He wants to reinvent classicism through Leo, Creer, and others, probably Quinn and Terry and people like that, and to do literal 18th century work, and I'm not interested in that.
Have you been approached to do any work in the Middle East or Egypt or any of this?
Yeah, we've won a competition, though they haven't told us we've won. We understand that we've won, for a theater near Dubai.
Oh, okay.
But we're working with a local architect here in Princeton, Ahmed Azmeh, who was a student of mine 30-some years ago. So Ahmed Azmeh was with a group called, and he brought us into it to do the competition as the designers. We've done the theater, and presumably we've won. We beat Skidmore and Merrill, but I don't know who else was in it. It was one of those things where we got the conditions of the competition, and we did the competition without even going to the site because there was no money to do that.
Pretty far too.
Yeah, and we submitted it, and presumably we won, but there's no client to respond to. There's nothing there. Azmeh is dealing with the client directly and trying to determine fees now and so on. But I would love to do that. I'd love to go to Egypt because I've never seen the monuments in Egypt. In the United States, amongst the young, they're anxious to do away with all of us. It's called killing the father. But all of us who are the age we are, we meaning even Eisenman, but Gwathmey and Meyer and Gary and all of us, my students are trained, I think, generally from other places rather badly. They come to Princeton for graduate work wanting to talk about architecture and do installation work rather than architecture. They don't know how to make a plan. They're not interested in making a plan. They're not interested in putting buildings together, but they are interested in the media. They're interested in modernity as it might be seen in terms of communication. And I think it's a very pessimistic time and I don't know whether it was the computer or not. I think it's perhaps the influence of machine and machine technology, and certainly the computer is a part of that. We use computers here, but we don't find them very dangerous because we use them for working drawings and for the production of buildings. And they don't scare me at all, but when people put up a video in a jury and call it a building, then I do worry. Then it is a pessimistic time. That finally for me is of so little interest that I've even considered stopping teaching because what's the point? This will pass too.
Yes.
Because history is cyclical, and as they say in this country, what goes around comes around, and I would imagine that in time, whether I'll be around or not, I don't know, but in time there will be a reinvestigation of not just the hand, but the anthropomorphic attitudes in architecture. It didn't really. It had an effect. I mean, economically it didn't, but in terms of building types, it did have an enormous effect. We, in a sense, traded all of the developer work that we were doing for new office buildings to become involved in more institutional work. Mm-hmm. We didn't do it actively. The development of offices simply stopped here and in Japan, where I was working. And we started to get more calls from universities and museums and so on to do work for them. So one supplanted the other, and so we really didn't feel it that much. I suppose it does have a slight economic effect, because some of the developments that we were working on when the recession hit were quite large, and therefore, in terms of supporting a place like this of 70, 80 people, it was more lucrative and better business, but nevertheless we have enough buildings to support those people, but not of that variety. Sure, in competitions I wouldn't be a juror on a competition of that kind of variety. I'm only interested in I mean, if all of the people were of the same sort as Peter Eisenman, then one could judge the best of that lot. Mm-hmm. But we call that kind of competition where, several styles are represented at Chinese menu, where you can pick from any column. I'm not interested in that, and I wouldn't participate. So it really wouldn't be a question. Oh, I suppose the key one would be the Whitney Museum, where I was quite surprised with the reaction of the architects, especially the architects who, I was trying to put the city back, and that's what upset the modernists. But I didn't know that people like I.M. Pei were so passionate about Breuer, and so that I was trying to do. And I think what they were really rebelling about was, one, that I was doing the commission and what I represented, and two, that I was trying to build Breuer into the city fabric.
Yes.
They wanted Breuer to stand alone, and since I don't believe in that, that was a difficulty for me. But I didn't read that as carefully as I should. But by the time we had done the third, Tom Armstrong, the director, had fallen out of favor with the board, and therefore we lost our primary. There's no, it's on the shelf. I mean, it's not going to happen. No, the new director is certainly not interested in that building.
Okay.
It's interesting that you ask the question, what buildings would you change and what would you redo? Understand that while I.M. Pei and people like I.M. Pei, Edward Larrabee Barnes and others were criticizing my building, I.M. Pei's glass was falling out of the John Hancock Tower, and enormous lawsuits, waste of time and energy for that level of abstraction of a reflective tower which should never have been in Copley Square in the first place, next to Richardson's great church. Yes. And you get a little bored and a little tired of people like that, whose buildings are actually dangerous to the society, criticizing what you're doing. No, I'm not worried about that. It's just that in a way, I don't believe in architects criticizing each other. I think it's an unethical practice. Yes. But it's an unethical practice when the architect who's doing the major criticism, as in I.M. Pei did in the Whitney Museum, when this architect causes all American architects' insurance to go up because of the damages claimed on his particular buildings. I mean, this is madness. This is a very strange time we live in. Why in Princeton?
Yes.
The university is here, and I've taught all my professional life, and this is a great university. I like concentrating on my work, and as you said when you arrived here, this is a very pleasant town.
Yes, it is. No doubt about it.
It's very easy for me to work here because my house is across the park. I can walk to it in 3 minutes. University is down the street. I can walk to it. This is what I believe in, not in a suburban sense, but in if the quarters of New York still worked as quarters, whether Greenwich Village or Soho or whatever, New York would be a palatable place for me. But New York is, I think, urbanistically, a very ugly child. 70 people.
I know what they
We have an office in New York. We can be from New York, but they work in New York. No, they are people who like the life of Princeton the way I do, and they have families, and they believe in walking to work and being able to concentrate. And I learn very much from my colleagues in New York, and therefore there's no reason to be around them except for conversation periodically. I mean, we do talk about architecture periodically and give each other critical advice on our work, but it's very rare. We've been approached by some people in the Far East to look at some proposals. None of those are at work now. We're doing a housing tower in Fukuoka. We're doing a tower for the Ministry of Culture in The Hague in the Netherlands, and we're doing a tall building for a hotel in Antwerp. But no, there aren't many tall buildings right now being built because most tall buildings are office buildings, and the office